Afghanistan has long held a unique and almost mythic reputation on the global stage, a nation unconquered through millennia, often referred to as the graveyard of empires. This rugged land, with its treacherous mountain ranges and endless deserts, has defied some of the most powerful armies in recorded history. Alexander the Great, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and even the modern coalition forces led by the United States have all attempted to impose their will upon it. Each, in turn, met with resounding failure, leaving behind a legacy of shattered ambitions and unanswered questions. But Afghanistan's defiance is more than a matter of strategy or terrain. Its towering mountains and labyrinthine valleys have become almost legendary for concealing mysteries, places where the known world seems to fade into whispers of the unknown. These mountains have not only hidden insurgents and guerrilla forces, they have harbored something older, stranger, and infinitely more compelling. For centuries, local folklore has spoken of enormous beings lurking in the isolated reaches of this land. Shepherds whisper of colossal figures seen against the twilight sky, their silhouettes impossibly large. Hunters speak of strange, bellowing cries echoing through the peaks, cries unlike any known creature. Villagers offer tales of giants, massive, terrifying beings whose existence teeters between myth and reality. Modern soldiers, however, have begun to echo these ancient tales. Deployed in the aftermath of 9/11s, tasked with navigating Afghanistan's harshest terrains, some servicemen claim to have encountered something beyond their training and comprehension. These accounts describe towering humanoid figures, giants that defy all natural explanation. Could these be remnants of an ancient race, spoken of in religious texts and myths around the world? Or are they an entirely different species, unknown to science, hiding in the untouched corners of the Afghan wilderness? The stories are as chilling as they are perplexing, drawing a fine line between fact and fiction. What is it about Afghanistan that allows such mysteries to endure? Its geography, vast, uncharted, and often inhospitable, plays a significant role. Endless mountain ranges provide a perfect sanctuary for creatures to avoid human interference, while the isolation of many villages keeps knowledge of such beings tightly contained. Even modern technology, with all its surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities, struggles to pierce the veil of Afghanistan's most remote regions. As the fog of war lifted and the focus turned to intelligence gathering, soldiers began reporting encounters that couldn't be easily dismissed. These were not the fabricated stories of idle gossip or the exaggerations of local villagers. They were first-hand accounts, delivered by battle-hardened men who had no reason to embellish the grim realities of war. In these mountains, myths seem to walk alongside reality. Tales of insurgents are intertwined with whispers of beings far older than any human conflict. This is a land that challenges everything we think we know, a place where ancient legends collide with modern testimonies. So, what did these soldiers see? Were they simply overwhelmed by the stark isolation and psychological strain of war? Or were their accounts an unwelcome glimpse into a secret the world has yet to uncover? The answers may lie in the heart of Afghanistan's unforgiving terrain, where the line between myth and truth blurs with each passing step. This is where our journey begins. Welcome to the uncharted, the unexplained, and the unsettling. These are the stories of Afghanistan's giants. The Kandahar Giant. The year was 2002, and the war in Afghanistan was still in its early stages. The United States military had launched Operation Enduring Freedom in the wake of the September 11th attacks, targeting the Taliban regime and its al-Qaeda allies. The Kandahar region, with its sprawling deserts and rugged mountains, had quickly become a critical focus for military operations. For centuries, its landscape had been a natural stronghold, a place where invaders faced overwhelming challenges. And for the soldiers stationed there, the environment was as much an enemy as the insurgents they pursued. It began as a routine mission, part of the military's search and destroy strategy. A special forces team had been dispatched into the mountains of Kandahar to track suspected insurgent activity. These missions often involved navigating narrow footpaths, clearing cave systems, and gathering intelligence from remote villages. For days, the team maintained radio contact, reporting back on their progress. Then, without warning, the communications ceased. The silence was troubling. Search teams knew that in Afghanistan, anything could happen: ambushes, IEDs, or even simple accidents in the unforgiving terrain. The second team of highly trained soldiers was quickly assembled and sent into the region. Their orders were clear: find the missing patrol and, if necessary, recover their bodies. The team moved cautiously through the mountains, the weight of their gear compounded by the steep paths and thin air. The terrain offered no mercy, but the soldiers had trained for this. What they weren't prepared for was the scene they encountered after hours of searching. Scattered across the rocky ground were the unmistakable remnants of the missing patrol's equipment. Uniforms lay in tatters, helmets cracked open, and pieces of military gear were strewn about like breadcrumbs leading deeper into the mountains. Then they found the bones. Human remains, broken and gnawed, littered the ground near the entrance to a cave. The soldiers froze, their weapons drawn. There was no time to process what they were seeing, only the grim realization that whatever happened here, it wasn't an ordinary ambush. The men exchanged uneasy glances, the tension palpable in the thin mountain air. "Stay sharp," the team leader whispered, rifles up. As they approached the cave, the air seemed to thicken. The soldiers felt the weight of unseen eyes watching them. Then, with a guttural roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet, it emerged. The creature that charged out of the cave was like nothing they had ever seen. It stood at least 13 feet tall, its muscular frame wrapped in animal hides. Thick, matted red hair crowned its head, and its face contorted in a primal snarl. In its massive hand, it gripped a wooden spear, crudely fashioned but undeniably deadly. The creature moved with terrifying speed, closing the distance between itself and the soldiers in moments. Before anyone could react, the giant drove its spear through the nearest soldier, lifting him off the ground like a rag doll. The rest of the team opened fire, their automatic rifles unleashing a torrent of bullets. For what felt like an eternity, the giant absorbed the assault, its monstrous form refusing to fall. But as the barrage continued, the creature's movements slowed, and with a final, earth-shaking roar, it collapsed. The soldiers stood in stunned silence, their rifles still trained on the now lifeless body. The creature lay sprawled before them, its sheer size and the stench of its corpse an assault on the senses. It was unlike anything they had ever encountered human, yet not. The men were shaken, their training and discipline barely masking their disbelief. The team radioed their command, delivering a situation report that must have sounded like madness to the ears on the other end. A Chinook helicopter was dispatched to their location, carrying specialized equipment to retrieve the body. When it arrived, the team worked quickly to secure the giant's corpse, the stench making the task nearly unbearable. Back at the base, the soldiers were debriefed and immediately sworn to secrecy. They signed non-disclosure agreements, forbidding them from ever speaking about the encounter. The giant's body was loaded onto another aircraft and flown to an undisclosed location. The men never saw it again. What had they killed? A relic of an ancient race, a creature science had yet to discover, or something that defied explanation entirely? The questions haunted the soldiers long after their deployment ended, their silence enforced not only by their superiors, but by the fear of being disbelieved or ridiculed. In the years since, fragments of this story have surfaced, an anonymous Chinook pilot describing the giant's transport, whispers among military circles, and second-hand accounts from those who claim to have been there. The details vary, but the core of the story remains chillingly consistent. For those who believe, the giant of Kandahar is more than just a tale of war. It's a glimpse into a hidden world, a reminder that even in the age of modern technology, some mysteries remain untouched by human understanding. The story of the Kandahar giant is not an isolated tale. It resonates with myths, legends, and historical accounts of giants from cultures across the world. For centuries, humanity has spoken of towering beings, sometimes revered as gods, other times feared as monsters. From the Bible to ancient Greek mythology, giants are an enduring part of our collective consciousness. Could these tales be more than mere allegory? In the Bible, giants are referenced multiple times, often associated with the Nephilim, a mysterious race said to be the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. Described as mighty men of old, men of renown, the Nephilim were giants who lived in the pre-flood world. One of the most famous biblical giants is Goliath, the Philistine warrior defeated by a young David. Standing nearly 10 feet tall, Goliath was an imposing figure, armed with a spear described as massive even by modern standards. But Goliath was not the only giant mentioned in biblical texts. In the second book of Samuel, another giant is described, notable for having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, a detail eerily similar to descriptions of the Kandahar giant. The book of Deuteronomy speaks of Og, king of Bashan, whose iron bed measured 13 feet in length. These accounts suggest that giants were not merely one-off anomalies, but part of a broader narrative of ancient, powerful beings. Beyond the Bible, giants appear in the myths of nearly every culture. In Greek mythology, the Titans were primordial giants who predated the Olympian gods. These colossal beings were said to have incredible strength and were often depicted as forces of chaos and destruction. Similarly, Norse mythology speaks of the Jotnar, giant beings who lived in Jotunheim, a realm separate from that of humans and gods. The Jotnar were both enemies and occasional allies of the gods, embodying the untamed forces of nature. Native American legends also speak of giants. The Paiute tribe tells of the sightings, a race of red-haired giants who were said to be fierce and cannibalistic. According to the legend, the sightings were eventually defeated and driven into caves by the tribe's ancestors. Interestingly, some archaeological digs in Nevada's Lovelock Cave have unearthed unusually large bones and artifacts, though these findings remain controversial. In Afghanistan, similar tales persist in local folklore. Villagers in remote regions speak of deva, or giant-like beings, that dwell in the mountains and rarely show themselves to humans. These stories often describe the giants as both terrifying and sacred, capable of immense destruction but also embodying a deep connection to the land. Could these ancient Afghan myths be rooted in real encounters with beings like the Kandahar giant? Some researchers believe these legends could be remnants of oral histories passed down through generations, preserving memories of encounters with beings that defy modern explanation. The consistency of certain details, extra digits, massive size, and predatory behavior suggests a common thread, possibly hinting at a shared experience across cultures and time periods. Could these giants be a lost branch of human evolution? Scientists have long speculated about the existence of hominids that reached extraordinary sizes. Fossil evidence of Gigantopithecus, a massive ape that stood up to 10 feet tall, proves that large humanoid-like creatures once roamed the earth. Although Gigantopithecus is believed to have gone extinct hundreds of thousands of years ago, some speculate that its descendants could have survived in isolated regions. Alternatively, the giants of legend might represent an entirely separate species, one that managed to evade extinction by retreating to remote, uninhabitable areas like the mountains of Afghanistan. The region's harsh conditions and relative inaccessibility could make it the perfect refuge for such creatures, allowing them to remain hidden from modern science. Another compelling theory ties these giants to ancient structures that defy explanation. Across the globe, megalithic sites such as Stonehenge, the Great Pyramid of Giza, and the ruins of Baalbek in Lebanon exhibit feats of engineering that seem impossible for their time. Some have speculated that these structures could have been built, or at least inspired by beings with extraordinary strength and intelligence. The Kandahar giant, with its red hair, massive size, and primitive weaponry, fits neatly into this global tapestry of myth and mystery. But is it a relic of an ancient race, or something even stranger? The connections between modern sightings and ancient accounts suggest that giants may not be mere figments of the imagination. They could represent a hidden chapter of human history, one that continues to linger in the shadows of our world. In Afghanistan's remote mountain ranges, where the past feels closer to the surface, these questions take on a tangible urgency. For the soldiers who claimed to have encountered giants, the experience was not just an anomaly, it was a window into a world that defies explanation, one where the line between myth and reality blurs. As we piece together these stories, the tantalizing possibility emerges that giants were, and perhaps still are, very real. Their legacy is written in the myths of every culture, etched into the stones of ancient monuments, and whispered through the mountains of Afghanistan. Whether they are remnants of the past or survivors of a hidden world, the giants remind us that there is much we have yet to understand about our own history. The idea of giants roaming the earth in the modern era is one that most scientists and skeptics dismiss outright. After all, how could beings so massive remain hidden in a world increasingly dominated by satellite imagery, advanced reconnaissance, and global interconnectedness? Yet the stories persist. Soldiers, villagers, and even drone operators continue to describe encounters with towering humanoids, particularly in remote regions like Afghanistan's mountain ranges. How do these accounts fit into our understanding of the world today? One of the most immediate responses to such claims is skepticism, and for good reason. The scientific community demands hard evidence, fossils, DNA, or direct physical remains. Without these, giants remain relegated to the realm of mythology and cryptozoology. The lack of verified physical evidence often leads many to dismiss stories like the Kandahar giant as war-induced hallucinations, exaggerations, or outright fabrications. However, even the most skeptical observers must grapple with one undeniable fact: the consistency of these reports. Across different branches of the military and among locals in isolated regions, the descriptions remain strikingly similar. Soldiers recount beings over 12 feet tall, often with red hair, extra digits on their hands and feet, and primitive weaponry. Villagers tell of enormous humanoid figures that appear only under specific conditions, such as at twilight or during certain seasonal migrations. This consistency raises the question: are these witnesses lying, or is there something more to these stories? The United States government, unsurprisingly, has maintained an official position of denial. When asked about the Kandahar giant, the Department of Defense stated that it had no records or knowledge of any such encounter. This response, while predictable, has only fueled conspiracy theories. Some believe the government is actively covering up the existence of giants to avoid public panic or to preserve the strategic use of the creatures in classified research. Proponents of this theory often point to other instances of alleged government secrecy. From UFO sightings to experimental military technology, there is a long history of governments withholding information under the guise of national security. Could the Kandahar giant be another example of this pattern? If so, what would the military gain from keeping such encounters hidden? Some theorize that giants, if proven to exist, could have a profound impact on fields like anthropology, biology, and even theology, areas that might challenge established scientific and cultural paradigms. The role of technology in these sightings also invites scrutiny. Soldiers today are equipped with advanced tools such as night vision goggles, thermal imaging, and high-resolution cameras. Drone operators use these technologies to scan vast areas of terrain, often capturing what the human eye cannot. And yet, most reports of giants remain anecdotal with little verifiable evidence to back them up. Why is this the case? One explanation is that the environments where these giants are allegedly found, dense forests, rugged mountains, and isolated caves, are inherently difficult to surveil. Even with modern technology, these areas remain largely unexplored. Additionally, the fleeting nature of the sightings makes it difficult to capture clear images or recordings. A creature that appears for mere moments before disappearing into the wilderness would leave little behind but uncertainty and speculation. Another factor is the psychological toll of war. Soldiers operating in high-stress environments are prone to heightened senses, paranoia, and misinterpretation of what they see and hear. Could some of these encounters be the result of overactive imaginations, fatigue, or fear? It's a possibility that skeptics often raise, though it doesn't account for the detailed descriptions or the consistency across multiple accounts. The cultural lens through which these stories are told also plays a significant role. In regions like Afghanistan, where folklore and oral traditions are deeply ingrained, stories of giants may reflect a blend of myth and reality. Local villagers, for example, might interpret unexplained phenomena through the lens of their cultural beliefs, adding layers of symbolism and legend to otherwise mundane events. When these tales are retold by soldiers unfamiliar with the culture, they can take on a life of their own, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Yet, for all the skepticism and rational explanations, some researchers argue that dismissing these stories outright may be a mistake. Throughout history, many phenomena once considered mythical, like the giant squid or the okapi, were later proven to exist. Could giants be another case of reality hiding in plain sight, waiting to be rediscovered? One of the most compelling aspects of the modern giant phenomenon is the global nature of the reports. Afghanistan is not the only place where people claim to have seen such beings. From the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest to the dense jungles of South America, stories of giants crop up in areas that share one common trait: inaccessibility. These regions, much like the mountains of Afghanistan, provide the perfect cover for creatures that wish to remain undetected. Ultimately, the question of giants in the modern era touches on a deeper human fascination with the unknown. Whether they are remnants of an ancient race, survivors of a hidden species, or simply the product of imagination, giants challenge our understanding of the natural world. They force us to confront the possibility that there are still secrets waiting to be uncovered, even in an age where we believe we've mapped and measured nearly everything. For now, the giants of Afghanistan and other remote corners of the world remain a mystery. But as technology advances and our ability to explore the unexplored grows, who knows what we might discover? Until then, these stories serve as a reminder that the world is far stranger and far more intriguing than we often give it credit for. Chechen fighters are giants. In the remote regions of Afghanistan, the lines between myth, reality, and war often blur. Soldiers on the ground are not just confronted with insurgents and the challenges of rugged terrain, they are also exposed to the unexplained. Among these stories is a chilling account from a journalist and army veteran named Mike, who recounted an encounter during a human intelligence gathering mission near the border with Pakistan. Mike's unit was tasked with interviewing local village elders to gather information on Taliban movements. These missions were often unpredictable, relying on the cooperation of villagers who were wary of both the Taliban and foreign troops. On one such mission, an elder shared a piece of information that left the soldiers puzzled and uneasy. Through an interpreter, the elder warned them to avoid a particular mountain range nearby. When pressed for details, he described a group of individuals living there, individuals who were not Taliban, nor any other group familiar to the villagers. According to the elder, these beings were pale-skinned, unusually tall, and extremely aggressive. They had a habit of harassing villagers who ventured too close, often throwing large rocks at them or stealing their livestock. Mike and his team were initially skeptical. The description sounded like it could have referred to foreign fighters, possibly Chechen mercenaries, known for their pale complexion and presence in the region. To clarify, Mike asked the elder if these individuals carried weapons or used any equipment resembling modern military gear. The elder's response was unsettling. No, they do not carry rifles. They are like you, tall and pale, but they wear clothing like us. And they are very strong. The elder emphasized their immense size and strength, gesturing with his hands to indicate towering figures. He mentioned that the villagers avoided these mountains altogether, as encounters with these beings rarely ended well. The warning was clear: whatever lived in those mountains was not to be disturbed. Intrigued but cautious, Mike relayed this information to his superiors. However, the response was dismissive. It's nothing to worry about, they told him, brushing off the elder's account as local superstition or a misunderstanding. Yet, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The elder's sincerity and the specificity of his warning lingered in his mind long after the mission was over. Years later, as Mike read more about the alleged encounters with giants in Afghanistan, he began to reconsider what the elder had said. The description of pale-skinned, tall, and aggressive beings matched the accounts of other soldiers who claimed to have seen giants in the region. Could the villagers have been referring to the same creatures? Or was it possible that they were describing something else entirely, perhaps a group of isolated, nomadic humans with extraordinary physical traits? Speculation about these beings often falls into two camps. The first suggests they could be remnants of a hidden race, perhaps an offshoot of humanity that developed in isolation. The rugged mountains and sparse population of the region would provide the perfect conditions for such a group to remain undetected for centuries. Their pale skin and towering stature might be the result of genetic adaptation to their environment. The second theory ties these beings to ancient legends of giants. The Kandahar giant, with its red hair and primitive weaponry, seems to fit the archetype of a mythical giant. If such creatures exist, it's possible they've managed to survive in small numbers, retreating to remote areas to avoid human contact. The aggression described by the elder could be a defensive response to encroachment on their territory. Skeptics, of course, argue that the elder's account was likely a mix of local folklore and mistranslation. The villagers may have embellished the story to explain encounters with particularly large or strong individuals, or to dissuade outsiders from venturing into the mountains. It's also possible that the description of pale-skinned beings was simply a reference to foreign fighters, like Chechen mercenaries, whose appearance would have been unfamiliar to the villagers. Yet Mike's story raises more questions than it answers. Why were the villagers so adamant in their warning? And why did their description align so closely with other accounts of giants in Afghanistan? While the evidence remains anecdotal, the consistency of these stories suggests there may be more to them than mere coincidence. For Mike, the encounter with the elder became a moment of reflection, a reminder of how little we truly understand about the world's most remote regions. Whether the beings described were giants, foreign fighters, or something else entirely, the experience left an indelible mark on him. As he later remarked, "In those mountains, you learn to expect the unexpected. Sometimes the stories you hear out there aren't just stories." Mike's account adds another layer of intrigue to the growing body of testimonies about giants in Afghanistan. It's a story that sits on the border of reality and myth, leaving room for both skepticism and wonder. Perhaps the answers lie in the mountains themselves, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to seek them out. The Giant of Korangal. The Korangal Valley, often referred to as the Valley of Death, was one of the most perilous assignments in Afghanistan. Its dense forests and jagged cliffs seemed to close in on soldiers, swallowing them into an unforgiving terrain. For those stationed there, danger came from every direction. Insurgents used the narrow paths and rocky outcroppings to stage ambushes, while the environment itself seemed hostile. Loose rocks that could trigger deadly falls, oppressive heat during the day, and freezing cold at night. It was a place that demanded constant vigilance, where even a momentary lapse in focus could mean death. In 2009, a patrol team found themselves navigating this treacherous terrain on a routine night mission. The air was thick with tension, the kind that only came with the silence of the mountains at night. The moonless sky offered no light, leaving the soldiers to rely on their equipment to detect threats in the darkness. Among them was a soldier equipped with a thermal imaging scope, a device designed to pick up heat signatures, an invaluable tool in a place where insurgents often struck under the cover of night. The patrol moved cautiously, every sound amplified in the stillness. Loose gravel under boots, the faint rustling of leaves, the occasional click of a radio, it all felt magnified, as though the valley itself was listening. As they reached a high vantage point overlooking the valley, the soldier with the scope began scanning the landscape below. For a while, his screen revealed nothing unusual: the familiar cold outlines of trees, boulders, and the uneven contours of the land. But then, something caught his attention: a faint glow at the edge of the forest. The soldier stopped in his tracks, signaling the others to halt. He focused the scope on the source of the heat signature, his heart quickening. At first, it seemed like a group of insurgents, perhaps gathered around a small fire. This was a common tactic, and his mind quickly began calculating the distance and how to alert the rest of the team. But as he adjusted the scope to sharpen the image, what he saw made his breath catch. It wasn't a group at all. It was one figure, massive and impossibly tall. The figure stood completely upright, its heat signature illuminating the screen like a glowing silhouette against the cold backdrop of the trees. The soldier's hands tensed around his weapon as he tried to process what he was seeing. The figure's head was level with the tree canopy, which he estimated to be at least 10 feet tall, possibly more. "I thought maybe I was imagining things," he would later recount, the disbelief still evident in his voice. "But I kept watching, and it moved. It wasn't a glitch. It was walking, slow and steady, like it didn't care who was watching." The figure moved with a deliberate grace, each step covering an unnatural amount of ground. Its movements were slow but powerful, exuding an eerie sense of calm. The soldier strained his eyes, trying to make out more details, but the thermal imaging only revealed the heat, a massive humanoid shape that dwarfed anything he had ever encountered. The rest of the team whispered among themselves, sensing the soldier's unease but unable to see what he was focused on. He didn't answer them immediately, his attention locked on the figure. It continued its slow march along the edge of the forest before vanishing into the dense foliage. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, swallowed by the valley's shadowy depths. The soldier lowered his scope, his hands trembling slightly. For a long moment he didn't say a word, his mind racing to comprehend what he had just witnessed. When he finally turned to his team leader to report the sighting, the reaction was far from what he expected. His superior officer listened, nodded, and then dismissed it with a shrug. "Just keep your eyes open," was all he said before ordering the patrol to continue. The soldier wanted to protest, to insist that what he had seen was real, but he knew better. In a place like the Korangal, where survival often hinged on maintaining focus and following orders, there was no room for discussing what couldn't be explained. So he kept quiet, though the image of the towering figure burned itself into his memory. As the patrol moved on, the soldier found himself glancing back toward the forest's edge, half expecting to see the figure emerge again. But the valley was silent, the darkness impenetrable. Whatever it was, it had vanished without a trace, leaving only questions in its wake. Was it an insurgent in some sort of camouflage? A trick of the equipment? Or had he glimpsed something far stranger, something that didn't belong in the world he thought he knew? The memory of that night stayed with him long after his deployment ended. The figure's towering silhouette, its unhurried movements, and the way it seemed to disappear as if it had never been there at all. It was a mystery he would never solve, a question that lingered in the back of his mind like a shadow cast by the Valley of Death. The drone operator's account. High above the rugged mountains of Afghanistan, unmanned aerial vehicles, or drones, silently scan the landscape. For the operators controlling these machines from remote locations, the view offers an unparalleled perspective on the terrain below. They are the unseen eyes of modern warfare, observing and recording everything in their path. Yet for one drone operator, this vantage point revealed something far beyond the scope of his training or understanding. It was a routine surveillance mission, monitoring a remote area deep within the mountains. The operator had spent hours staring at the infrared screen, tracking potential insurgent movements. The region was isolated, dotted with small villages and rocky outcroppings that provided perfect cover for enemy forces. It was quiet, almost too quiet, as the drone glided silently over the rugged terrain. Then, near a small cluster of mud huts, something unusual caught his attention. At first glance, it appeared to be a group of villagers gathered around a fire. The heat signatures were clear and distinct, glowing brightly against the cooler backdrop of the night. This was a common sight, and the operator almost moved on. But something made him hesitate. Something about the proportions of the figures didn't seem right. Zooming in, he adjusted the focus and stared at the screen in disbelief. These weren't ordinary villagers. The figures were massive, far larger than any human he had ever seen. They towered over the fire, their heat signatures revealing long humanoid shapes that dwarfed the nearby goats. The animals, tethered to a post, looked no bigger than house cats in comparison. There were 3 or 4 of them, the operator later recounted. They were just standing there, moving around the fire. At first I thought maybe it was an equipment glitch, but the more I watched, the clearer it became. These were people or something like people, but they were huge. The figures moved slowly, their silhouettes indistinct but unmistakably humanoid. They appeared to be wearing cloaks or robes, their shapes heavily draped in fabric. One figure bent down to tend to the fire, its movements deliberate and calm. Another stood off to the side, holding what looked like a long, staff-like object. Their behavior seemed almost mundane, like villagers going about their nightly routine except for their size. The operator watched, transfixed, for several minutes. He noted their height relative to the surrounding structures and trees, estimating them to be at least 10 to 12 feet tall. Despite their massive size, they moved with a quiet grace, their actions unhurried and methodical. He tried to capture the feed, ensuring that every detail was recorded, but the strange figures didn't do anything particularly dramatic. They didn't seem to notice or care about the drone hovering thousands of feet above them. It was surreal, he said. I've seen plenty of people on these screens, villagers, insurgents, even wildlife, but nothing like this. It was like watching something out of a storybook. They weren't hiding or running. They were just there. The drone eventually moved on, following its programmed flight path, and the strange figures disappeared from view. The operator hesitated to report what he had seen. How could he explain it? Would anyone believe him? In the world of military operations, where precision and logic reigned supreme, there was little room for tales of giants. Instead, he filed the footage away, careful to note the coordinates of the sighting. It became one of those moments that stuck with him, a mystery he couldn't shake. He would replay the images in his mind, trying to make sense of what he had seen. Were they an unknown group of humans, some isolated tribe with unique physical traits? Or were they something else entirely, something science had yet to discover? Years later, the operator would come across stories of the Kandahar giant and other sightings of enormous humanoid beings in Afghanistan. The details matched too closely to ignore. The towering figures, the remote locations, the way they seemed to exist just beyond the fringes of human understanding, it all aligned with what he had witnessed on that quiet night. I don't know what they were, he admitted. But I know what I saw. And whatever it wasn't normal. The memory of the figures remains a vivid, unanswered question, a reminder that even in the age of modern technology, some things still elude explanation. High above the mountains, with only the faint hum of the drone for company, the operator had glimpsed a secret that the world wasn't ready to acknowledge. The giant of Uruzgan. The Uruzgan province of Afghanistan, with its rocky terrain and scattered villages, was another hotspot for military operations during the war. For soldiers stationed there, Every patrol and every watch carried a palpable tension. The danger of insurgents was constant, but for one Australian officer, a late-night sentry duty would reveal a threat far beyond anything he had imagined. It was a clear night, the kind that offered a breathtaking view of the stars but left the ground shrouded in darkness. The officer was perched atop a light-armored vehicle, LAV, scanning the surrounding area for any signs of movement. Equipped with a thermal imaging device, he methodically swept the landscape, noting the usual heat signatures of wildlife and the faint outlines of distant structures. As he panned the device over a distant ridge, something unusual caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a group of people moving along the ridge, a rare sight in such an isolated area at this time of night. But as he focused on the heat signature, his heart began to race. It wasn't a group. It was one figure, and it was enormous. The officer adjusted the device to get a clearer view. The figure's silhouette became sharper, and its sheer size was impossible to ignore. Even from nearly 2 kilometers away, it stood out against the backdrop of the ridge. He used the laser rangefinder to measure the distance, confirming that the figure was over 1,800 meters away. Despite the distance, it was clearly massive, far larger than any human could be. It was walking upright, the officer later recounted. Slow, deliberate steps like it had all the time in the world. Its size was unreal. Even at that distance, it looked like a giant. The figure moved with an almost unnatural calm, its stride covering an impressive amount of ground. The officer strained to gather more details, but the thermal imaging only provided a rough outline, a towering humanoid figure that dwarfed everything around it. He estimated it to be at least 12 feet tall, its heat signature glowing against the cooler landscape. He watched the figure for what felt like an eternity, though it was likely only a few minutes. The creature moved along the ridge, eventually disappearing behind the jagged rocks and out of his line of sight. The officer kept scanning the area, hoping it would reappear, but the night remained still and quiet. When his shift ended, he debated whether to report what he had seen. How could he explain it without sounding ridiculous? "I saw a giant" wasn't exactly the kind of report that would be taken seriously in a war zone. Instead, he kept the sighting to himself, convinced that no one would believe him. Years later, the memory of that night still haunted him. He had seen something that defied explanation, something that didn't belong in the world he knew. When stories of the Kandahar giant and other alleged encounters with enormous beings began to surface, he couldn't help but draw parallels. The descriptions were eerily similar: towering figures, calm but deliberate movements, and an overwhelming sense of otherworldliness. "It wasn't something you'd expect to see," he admitted. "But I know what I saw. It wasn't normal. It wasn't human." The sighting left him with more questions than answers. Was it a trick of the light, a malfunction of the equipment? Or was it something far more extraordinary, a glimpse into a hidden world that few have ever seen? Whatever the truth, the giant of Uruzgan remains an enduring mystery, a story whispered among those who have served in the unforgiving landscapes of Afghanistan. The giant of Kunar. The Kunar province, a rugged and remote region in northeastern Afghanistan, is known for its steep cliffs, dense forests, and winding mountain paths. It's a place that tests the endurance and fortitude of anyone who dares to traverse it. For soldiers stationed there, every patrol brought with it the risk of ambush or worse. But in 2008, one soldier's night mission revealed a sight that left him questioning everything he thought he knew about the dangers hidden in those mountains. It was late at night, and the soldier's unit was tasked with monitoring a stretch of forested terrain suspected to be a Taliban supply route. Equipped with a new thermal imaging device, the soldier scanned the area carefully. The device was cutting edge, allowing for detailed heat signatures even in near total darkness. For a while, the screen showed nothing unusual, just the faint outlines of the forest, scattered boulders, and patches of open ground. Then he saw it. At first, the heat signature appeared as a cluster, similar to a group of insurgents huddled together. But as he adjusted the device's focus, the image became clearer. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a group of people. It was one massive figure standing upright and completely alone. The soldier froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure was enormous, its head level with the tops of the surrounding trees, which he estimated to be at least 12 feet tall. Its outline glowed brightly on the thermal screen, its size and shape unmistakably humanoid. It was massive, The soldier later recalled, "I kept checking the scope, thinking it had to be a mistake, but it wasn't. It was there, standing perfectly still, like it was watching." The figure began to move, its steps slow and deliberate. Despite its size, it moved with an eerie grace, covering ground effortlessly. The soldier followed its progress through the thermal scope, unable to tear his eyes away. He noted its proportions, the way its limbs moved, and the deliberate pace of its stride. It didn't seem to be in a hurry, nor did it appear concerned about being seen. "I don't know what it was doing," he said. "It wasn't acting like a normal person or even like an insurgent trying to avoid detection. It just moved." The figure walked along the ridge for several minutes before disappearing behind a cluster of trees. The soldier continued scanning the area, hoping to catch another glimpse, but the figure was gone. The forest returned to its eerie silence, as if nothing had happened. When the soldier reported the sighting to his superior officer, the reaction was predictable. "Probably a bear or something," the officer said with a dismissive shrug. But the soldier knew better. Whatever he had seen, it wasn't a bear. It wasn't even close. He kept the details of the sighting to himself after that, unwilling to risk ridicule or disbelief from his comrades. But the memory of the figure haunted him, a constant reminder of the strange and unexplained things that could be hiding in the remote corners of the world. Years later, the soldier would hear stories of the Kandahar giant and other encounters with enormous beings in Afghanistan. The descriptions were strikingly similar to what he had seen that night in Kunar, a towering humanoid figure, moving with calm deliberation, its presence both awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling. "I don't know what I saw," he admitted, "but I know it was real. You can't just forget something like that." The giant of Kunar, like so many other stories from Afghanistan's remote regions, remains shrouded in mystery. Was it an unknown species, a relic of an ancient past, or simply a trick of the mind? For the soldier who witnessed it, the answer may never come, but the memory of that towering figure will stay with him forever.